Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. We're having today our fifth and final session in a series on backlash, on countering backlash as part of the Men Engage Ubuntu Symposium. And today we'll be focusing on how to unite to counter backlash and looking forward at what we can really do as organizations, as alliances, as networks, as a movement to counter backlash. We are also using social media. So if you want to tweet or follow the conversation via social media, we're using the hashtags Ubuntu Symposium and Symposio Ubuntu in Spanish. And we do welcome you to share your thoughts, reflections, quotes from speakers. So again, we are having the fifth and final session in the series on countering backlash. And I will just set the stage a little bit today before we fully get started. But we know what is really important is that feminist activists from social movements around the world have been highlighting that a lot of progress has been made in gender equality and women's rights since the 1995 Beijing Platform for Action, but also that in recent years we are seeing that that progress is being threatened and in some cases reversed. And this is what we have been referring to as the backlash against gender justice and gender equality and social justice and human rights more broadly. So today we will be really focusing on the road ahead, what and how and what can we do together to respond to the backlash or to prevent further backlash from happening. And of course, actually, what we want to do is to continue chartering a progressive way forward together. And we're really centering intersectional alliance building and informing our work by feminist principles as key to the journey forward. And we're trying to figure out what men's engagement can contribute to to countering backlash and to a feminist vision forward. So in this series, over the course of the Ubuntu Symposium, we've had, like I said before, 4 sessions. So this will be the 5th. And activist researchers and policymakers have been coming together to share experiences, concerns, and tactics to counter backlash. And one of the key questions that we've been asking ourselves is how can work on masculinities or on transforming or eliminating patriarchal masculinities help to counter backlash, to counter patriarchal backlash. And we're framing that backlash as what happens against gender justice, against feminist progress more broadly, and human rights and social justice. And we've been hearing in this series, and we will hear today as well, from people involved in the women's and the men's pro-feminist and feminist networks and activist groups. And I think backlash has been, and how to handle backlash has been a cross-cutting theme, I think, throughout the Ubuntu Symposium in this series, but also in many other sessions. And I think from our side as Men Engage Alliance, addressing and talking about it, really, we seek that it reflects our commitment to counter backlash. And we are committed to learn more about what backlash is and looks like, and what are differences and similarities across different contexts, and to explore what an intersectional feminist analysis and approaches in our work can look like, while we are seeking to strengthen allyship with the broader feminist movement, but figuring out what transforming patriarchal masculinities and engaging men and boys can be a meaningful strategy and role in contributing to the broader feminist struggle. And Sinead, if you could share the speaker slide, thank you. So I'll just outline the program briefly. We will start with Jurka Edstrom, who will be looking back on the series and sharing some of the reflections on the key insights, dilemmas, and potential directions and recommendations for ways forward that have emerged so far. And then we really look forward to have a debate with a forward-looking perspective with various speakers. We'll be joined today by Lina Abirafe, who's the Executive Director of the Arab Institute for Women, by Neil Datta, the Secretary of the European Parliamentary Forum for Sexual and Reproductive Rights, by Artie Narcy, Civic Space Research Officer at Civicus, and by Bafana Kumalo, the co-chair of Men Engage Global Alliance and also a co-executive director of SOMKE. And I already mentioned Jurka Edstrom, Research Fellow, Institute of Development Studies. He will be co-moderating and facilitating the conversation with me today. I'm Joni van der Zand. I work as co-director of the Men Engage Global Secretariat. And yes, we really invite all of you who have joined us today to share your questions to the speakers in the chat box. We will have some time later on in the session to bring those questions in. But we will start the conversation after hearing from Jurka with some of the look back with 2 rounds of conversations between 2 speakers each. And like I mentioned before, we will be having a forward-looking perspective. And questions that we are kind of organized around are what we should do as organizations, networks, and movements going forward. How can work on masculinities help to counter patriarchal backlash? And how should we link across social justice movements to counter the backlash through strategic alliance building, and also while holding each other to account and while holding those working on engaging men and boys to transform patriarchal masculinities to account. So speakers will share their provocations for a few minutes, and then we will have a facilitated dialogue and a plenary debate. And we really would love to hear your questions for speakers, but also any reflections that you have or any of your own experiences. Do share them in the chat box. And if you could maybe now, Sinead, share the next slide. I just wanted to quickly to set the stage a little bit before handing it over to Jurka. Share that we have, as many of you I think by now know, launched a discussion paper on context and challenges for gender transformative work with men and boys. It was authored by Ellen Gregg, and it's also the context analysis to the current Men Engage strategic plan. And the paper was launched in 2020. And our new strategic plan is basically just starting off. But what that paper highlights is that there is a lot of evidence that suggests that backlash and patriarchal masculinities are related. And yeah, we recommend that you have a look at the paper. I think backlash is kind of a cross-cutting issue throughout the context analysis. But one of the things that we overall analyze is that anti-feminist mobilization is growing. And one of the things that it centers around is the aim of restoring the natural family unit, so a husband, a wife, and children, and opposing gender ideology, so gender justice ideology more broadly. And there's some evidence that this sense of a world in crisis, so because of the progress that has been made, resonates in particular with men. But it's also important that not to generalize men's rights activism, to reflect on how men's rights activism shows up differently in different contexts. And I think it's important to mention that, for example, in the global north, where a lot of this backlash is taking shape, this activism or men's rights activism or anti-feminist activism, if you will, is also commonly linked with the defense of white superiority and a backlash against progress made in anti-racism. And so it's important to look at these issues intersectionally. But there are some commonalities across contexts. The trend towards an increasingly visibility of men's rights activism appears to indicate that this is a reaction to the changing political economy of gender. So more women joining the workforce and men less often being the main breadwinner at home. and also a response to hard-won feminist gains for women's rights in many countries. So the backlash of men's rights against feminist progress is really part of the broader backlash that we're seeing. There's also, importantly, the political use of religious doctrine and reasserting and maintaining patriarchal masculinities, which is something that is kind of really very much part of politicized religion over history. And it's also very central to the patriarchal backlash that we're discussing here. So in response, we see that feminist movements are organizing increasingly visibly, vibrantly around a transformative vision for gender justice going forward and social justice more broadly. And this is really grounded in social justice, human rights, and economic and political transformation of the system, the current system that we live in. And given this vibrancy of the feminist movement and this need to further strengthen and build numbers and just strengthen our collective voice, it's really important that those of us who are working to engage men and boys and transform masculinities are thinking through and committing to how best to connect with, support, and act in solidarity with this upsurge in intersectional feminist movement organizing that is happening on the streets, but also in the halls of power. And I wanted to share those considerations just to set the stage for the conversation today. With that, I would love to first hand it over to Jurker to provide some look back on the series that we've had so far and set the stage further for our conversation. Over to you, Jurker.
Thank you so much, Yoni. That's a perfect place to hand over on, because today is really about this issue of how do we act in solidarity with feminist movements and intersectionally in particular. So I'm really excited about this session. Lots of participants here. Great to see so many names, if not yet faces, of people who have attended before and indeed spoken. So I will try and reflect on the series so far, the four first sessions, to sort of set the stage for today's discussion. But we put together the series really as, coming out of our program on Countering Backlash, linking up with Men Engage, who have also focused on backlash in the new strategic plan. That's one of the objectives. So the big questions really that faced us is, what is patriarchal backlash? What's driving it? Who is driving it? Why is it happening? Why are they doing that? Where is it happening and how is it happening? So those questions really kind of are the key questions for the first couple of sessions in the series. So the first session was called, starting at the very big level, it was called Understanding the Global Tide of Patriarchal Backlash. And we had three sets of conversations, a bit like today, of two speakers each, conversing around particular themes and issues. Now, the first one was around issues of racialized male supremacy and coloniality, if you like, the issue of race intersecting with gender in the backlash. So we had Alan Gregg, who you just heard about in reference to the background research for Men Engage, who spoke about a particular kind of a white male supremacist backlash, which is also rooted in proprietorial masculinities, the idea of ownership and stretching back to settler days and so on. And now David Chimba from Uganda, our partners at the Refugee Law Project, spoke of backlash as also very racialized in a colonial history, if you like, a longer history of colonialism, and not necessarily as visible, but very wrapped up in politics of the government, the Ugandan government. relationship to the international community, taking on the one hand, taking on gender commitments, gender equality commitments, but on the other hand, delaying non-implementation and various forms of subtle preventive backlash, if you like. Then the second conversation between Sana Contractor at CHSJ in India and Eva Selén from Kvinna till Kvinna in Sweden, who I believe has joined us. In fact, I saw your name coming up there. The second conversation was about ethno-nationalism and authoritarianism writ large. I mean, I'm simplifying hugely here. Looking more at the issue of, particularly since 9/11 and the economic crash and so on, how nations have become, or politics has become more inward-looking, and this demonizing of foreigners, linking ethnicity to nationhood, very clear in India with the Hindu nationalist politics, and across Europe with the rise of fascism, frankly, the far right. So that is another theme. That session finished with a bigger look and at the longer term of, kind of religion and politics, or religion into politics, a fascinating conversation between Sonia Correa and Denise Candioti about, on the one hand, the long histories of religious organizing from the 70s in the Catholic cradle leading up to Beijing. And on the other hand, Denise talking about the dispersed and complex politics of authoritarianism and the link between that and religious conservatism, the kind of opportunistic idea, the idea of using traditional ideas and power and religious ideologies to concentrate power. Okay, so the second session focused more on body politics and online misogyny. We had a great set of discussions around, of course, SRHR, women's bodies and sexuality as a core site of contestation for backlash, but it being very intersectional and othering at the same time as being focused on women's sexuality and bodies. Sabina Rashid from Jim Grant's School of Public Health in Bangladesh talked very much about how vicious attacks on women's reproductive rights are taking place both on the street and online, but connected very much with religious traditional values and this kind of blending of national sensitivities and religious sensitivities. Maria Alicia Gutierrez spoke about SRHR rights struggles in Argentina in Spanish, and unfortunately my Spanish wasn't good enough really to capture the essence of that so well. We heard from Neil Datta from the European Parliamentary Group on Sexual Reproductive Health and Rights. We'll be hearing more today from Neil, so we'll be picking up that conversation, but it was a fascinating issue around how disparate interests are coalescing around anti-gender ideology across Europe and other places. Then, of course, we had a discussion about online misogyny, hate and backlash with Alex DeBranco from the Institute on Male Supremacy in the US, talking about incels and various male pickup artists and actual sort of crimes and attacks online. Becky Faith from IDS spoke about similar issues more broadly, but also about this kind of levels of visibility and invisibility of power in terms of online spaces, but also in terms of digital platform and the broader digital economy, and how backlash may operate at very complex levels there, which are easy to miss if we're thinking could I have the next slide, please, Sinead? Yeah, so just to try and synthesize those two first sessions a bit, I thought about there are a lot of contradictions in the different experiences On the one hand, there's appeals to past gender orders and male supremacy and so on, a beautiful patriarchal past. But there's also a kind of nihilistic attitude to future in many strands of this. There's often very anti-global sentiments, either anti-EU, anti-West, anti-foreigners, but it's also transnational and connected. So there are diverse actors and diverse aims, but this confluence of interests in opposition to gender, ideas of gender identity or gender equality, I should say, or gender diversity for that matter. There are some key contestations. Across those two first sessions, we looked at the bordered nation and the traditional family in the first session as sites of contestation, and the natural body in the second session. So this table here is my attempt to read backlash through the intentions and aims of backlash actors and who those likely protagonists are and what some of the hot sites of contestation are. So the original understanding of backlash as a defensive reaction by privileged groups, such as men's rights activists, of course, has a restorative intent. We will have patriarchy and male supremacy back. Thank you very much. And the hot sites of contestation seems to be the sex body and the traditional family. Then there's this kind of more apprehensive pre-actions with preemptive intent. I mentioned Uganda and the politics there, where elites with broader interests in the status quo, but also corporates with interest in growing profits, quite keen on the privatized family and privatizing the care economy and so on, for example. Then there are these more proactive strategies from fundamentalist religious groups and or ethno-nationalist fascist groups, which have much broader aims, a bright future of ethnically cleansed kinds or a kind of a morally purer future. Now, the hot sites of contestation seem to be the traditional or faithful family and the ethnic nation, respectively. Then finally, of course, there are these opportunistic alliances where all of these or any of these plus others come together around instrumental aims, often with populist politicians and movements, authoritarian leaders, and so on. That's a combination of all of it. So let's move on to the final slide on my recap here. So session 3, we start to ask slightly different questions there. What do we do in our defense? How am I doing for time? I realize I've spoken for about 10 minutes. Have I got another 2-3 minutes?
Yes, Jurgen, no problem. Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. So the third session was called Hijacking Gender, Backlash in Policy and Practice, where we brought together partners doing research on policy and practice in some countries with other academics like Andrea Cornwall and policymakers, indeed, like Laura Turkett from UN Women and Lena Carlson from SIDA in Sweden. We looked at the country level at co-option and depoliticizing of gender policies in power politics, of balancing commercial and political interests in interaction with international opportunities and neoliberal pressures, not pleasures, unfortunately. We heard from Eamon Mwine at the CBR, Center for Basic Research in Uganda, as well as Sudarsana Kundu from Gender at Work in India. Tessa Lewin from IDS reflected on that and talked about Faloudi's concept of overt to covert to hidden onslaughts or attacks on gender equality. And she has this idea of discourse capture as an interesting way to analyze it. So Andrea Cornwall came in and talked about fascinating participatory action research at CSW over the last decade or so, where she's been witnessing increasingly professional strategies for the capture and reshaping of narratives at CSW by right-wing groups, or I should say backlash forces, including the creation of discourse coalitions and using gender as an organizing principle, and suggesting that we ought to be looking at masculinities and power dynamics within those spaces as a research topic ourselves. Thirdly, we heard from the policymakers in writ large here from Sweden and from the US. Lina describing the different bloc formations by governments and finding challenges around finding like-minded allies or organizing in defense of gender justice. And Laura discussing the politics of generating data and evidence to inform policymaking on gender at the UN level. And she was discussing the Families Report as a recent example where you can imagine there was a lot of contestation from conservative groups as well. The fourth session before this one was a much smaller conversations in groups where we reflected on experiences of backlash in our own context as civil society organizations or researchers, as activists, and others, and explore some potential strategies, start discussing some potential strategies and directions to support feminist action and social movements to counter backlash. Now, of course, that's what this conversation today continues. So I won't dwell on that. We took some notes and we'll be collating those notes together with the outcome of today's session. So the next slide, please, I believe is the end. And this is the session today. We're as Yoni has explained, we're looking at two conversations, first between Bafana Kumala and Lina Abirafe on gender identity politics and networks and movements, particularly around this question about men and masculinities. And then a second conversation between Neil Datta and who was in our second session, and Artie Narcy from Civicus around navigating gender politics and the policy spaces of governments and civil society in the broader political economy, if you like. And we'll have about 25 minutes for question time, we hope, plenary debate, and then closing with some thanks and wrapping up. So that's for me. Apologies for going over time a little bit, but I think we're still doing okay.
We are, Jurke.
John. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really helpful. Yeah, I have the honor to introduce our speakers a little bit in more detail. We have Artie Narcy. She is a South African feminist, writer, and journalist who documents human rights violations across the world, and currently doing so in her role as civic space researcher at Civicus, where she researches and tracks civic space and freedom of peaceful assembly, association, and expression in the Europe, Central Asia, and MENA region. And she consistently strives to shine the spotlight on gender, human rights, and civic space issues. She holds a Master of Science in Gender Policy and Inequalities from the London School of Economics and Political Science. Thank you for joining us, Artie. We have Dr. Lina Abirafe, is the Executive Director of the Arab Institute for Women at the Lebanese American University. The institute was established in 1973 as the first women's institute in the Arab region and is one of the first globally. Lina spent over 20 years in development and humanitarian contexts in countries such as Afghanistan, Haiti, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Nepal and many others, in focusing on gender-based violence prevention and response. And Lina completed her doctoral work from the London School of Economics and published Gender and Intersectional Aid in Afghanistan, the politics and effects of intervention, based on her research. And Lina is among the gender equality top 100 worldwide in 2018 and 2019. Thank you so much for joining us, Lina. And Neil Datta is the Secretary of the European Parliamentary Forum of Sexual and Reproductive Rights and has been so since 2004. And Neil founded the organization with a group of parliamentarians with the support of the International Planned Parenthood Federation, IPPF, in 2000. And he has been responsible for its growth to its current membership of over 30 all-party parliamentary groups and on population and development issues. Neil has over 15 years of experience in the field of political involvement in population and development, and he has conducted in-depth research on anti-choice activity in Europe, publishing a report in 2018 that continues to receive worldwide attention. And Neil holds 5 nationalities and is bilingual in English and French. And he holds a master's degree in European Public Administration from the College of Europe in Bruges and a Bachelor of Arts in History and Languages from the State University of New York at Binghamton. Thank you so much for joining us as well, Neil. And we have Bafana Kumalo, is the co-executive director at Sonke Gender Justice and one of the organization's co-founders. And he is also the co-chair of Men Engage Global Alliance. He has a long track record in the NGO sector in South Africa, working on HIV prevention, gender equality, and masculinities. And he has served as a commissioner at the National Commission for Gender Equality. Active in the anti-apartheid struggle, Bafana worked with the Soweto Civic Association and subsequently participated in the peace accords. Bafana is also an ordained pastor in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Southern Africa and volunteers his service to the Tembisa East Parish in Gauteng. He holds a bachelor in theology with honors and a master's in theology from the University of Natal in Pietermaritzburg. Thank you so much also, Bafana, for joining us. And with that, I would like to start us off with the first 2 provocations. We will be hearing from Lina and Bafana. And just for a couple of minutes, we would like to start with Bafana, because we are going to actually really hone in on the engaging men and transforming masculinities part. This is the 5th and final session in the series on Countering Backlash, and we're really diving into, I think, what's the core of Men Engage Alliance's work. And so, Bafana, we would love to hear from you. Just a couple of minutes, your first response to the question, how should civil society activists and actors and networks focused on engaging men for gender equality address backlash against gender justice?
Thank you very much, Yoni, and congratulations, colleagues, for very exciting conversations that have been going on this subject. So it's a pleasure to be part of this interesting conversation. Well, coming from the South African experience, I think it's always important that in engaging on this work, we present the evidence on how working with men and boys for positive masculinities makes a difference. Because when you present evidence, people can't deny evidence. We have seen in our context, as you will all know, the South African experience, we've got very positive policies on gender transformation. We have leadership that has been pushing for transformation, but there's been lots of resistance. This resistance comes from several quarters, politicians, mainly groups that are led by men. Arguments like, well, you have Women's Month, which is a major intervention in our country, intended to balance the historical challenges that we have had, where women have been left out in developmental engagements, and therefore government introduces these interventions on an annual basis where there's a focus on women's advancement. And so men will argue, when are you having Men's Month? You know, when are you having Men's Day? When are you having, you know, men's this, men's that? As if men don't have enough privileges already in society. So as organizations that are working on positive masculinities, we push back to remind men that the truth of the matter is that Men's Day is every day, you know, and therefore there's no need to have a special focused campaign that focuses on men, because in any event, in terms of how our society is organized, men remain privileged in many respects. And so the reason why we have Women's Day, we try and appropriate, you know, why that is important and how that contributes towards humanizing our society and making us achieve our broader objectives of ensuring that women are also given a positive role in society. We have, as you would know, for instance, progressive legislation on sexual reproductive health. We have a termination of pregnancy policy that is far advanced for its time, very progressive. And we are receiving a lot of backlash from the right-wing religious groupings who argue for, pro-life and all sorts of arguments. And our pushback, of course, is to remind people that women's bodies are women's bodies. Women have a right to choose, and that is not subject to men's ratification on what is it that women can choose for themselves and what is good for themselves, for their health, and for their bodies. And so it's always important, I believe, that we need to counter these arguments so that we don't allow a narrative that posits women's development in a negative light and make that, an acceptable argument. We need to pose counter arguments which ensures that the position that is taken in advancing gender transformation is well represented and society understands why that is happening. You may know that in South Africa, we are currently looking at our marriage law. And in that law, it's looking at how do we ensure that all sectors of society are represented. Our current law, for instance, does not recognize Muslim marriages. There were lots of inconsistencies in terms of the age of marriage and people using culture to justify marrying younger girls and all sorts of things. So the intention now is to strengthen that legal regime for marriages to ensure that it's according to our policies in our constitution, our values, and recognizes all human beings. Now, somebody made a submission, which is their right, and called for the need to consider polyandry, which has elicited a very exciting conversation in South Africa. But interestingly enough, colleagues, most of the people who are arguing and debating are men. And strangely enough, many of these men who are resisting even the engagement of the consideration of polyandry are men who are married in polygamous marriages. And they are now appropriating this thing of having many partners is only okay for men. They argue culture, they argue religion. So we counter and say, but what is wrong with women choosing to also have many relations? How does that harm you? You've been privileged to enjoy these relationships because our constitution recognizing customary law. Now, what's wrong with women deciding that they want to have this? And then it's appropriated as it's uncultural, it's not part of our African culture. So we remind people and say, by the way, if you check African culture in its broader context, polyandry was a recognized system. We still have communities in Africa that actually celebrate and live under a polyandry system. So in short, Yoni, I am saying it's important that those of us who are operating in this space, particularly men, we need to counter these arguments by putting evidence when these people raise these issues to say, but you are wrong, and this is the reason why you are wrong. Put out the research that is out there, put out how this is actually making women's lives better when they are allowed to enjoy full sexual reproductive health and rights in a society and make decisions for themselves, how that transforms the developmental trajectory of a country. And people can't argue against that because the evidence is out there. And we try and show that actually we have many men who support these initiatives and they have not changed their agenda because they are supporting feminist approaches. They are supporting human rights. On the contrary, men who support these efforts confirm that they are having much more healthier relationships with their partners. They are much more happier. They have stronger relations even with their children. They have good relationships with everyone in society. And so actually engaging in positive masculinities is not only good for us as men, it's good for society. Thank you.
Thank you, Bafana. So really clearly countering the narratives that those basically articulating backlash are putting forward. You mentioned that narrative includes centering that women are autonomous beings, that they have choices, and also making men aware of their own privileges, as well as that gender equality and equal gender norms, if you will, are good for them. It will make them happier and have better relationships. So clear focus on counter narratives in a way. Thank you for that. So then with that, Lina, over to you. Thank you so much. Good to see you again. We're really happy you were able to join us today.
Thank you. Thank you for letting me parachute in at the last minute and join this important conversation.
We're so happy you are here, even though we knew that you had very little time to prepare. So we're just going to have a flowing dialogue. But for you, the first question, just to share your thoughts for a couple of minutes, is when we talk about engaging men in countering anti-feminist backlash, which men are we to engage, how and why? Do you have any thoughts around that?
Oh, I have lots of thoughts. First of all, I just want to echo what Bafana said, which was awesome. Thank you. Making the case with evidence, because the case is there. There is evidence. There is ample research. We know that working with men makes a difference. But yes, it has to be nuanced, right? Which men, where, under what conditions? For me, my question is this. When we talk about the backlash, which is inevitably happening, it's taking on a lot of forms in a lot of different places. There is obviously a political backlash that we're feeling. There is even a resistance at the domestic level, increased intimate partner violence and all of these things that are evidence of the backlash. There is a backlash in terms of the financial resources dedicated to women's rights and to feminist work. So, what is what type of backlash are we talking about? Is this a constricted political space or the finances or whatever? Look at COVID. I mean, as a great example, right? We're just at the tail end, I'd like to say end, of a global pandemic that has redirected resources away from women's rights work. I mean, was that a backlash per se? No, but it was a resource reallocation that has restricted our work, changed the nature of our focus to the detriment of women, increased intimate partner violence in ways that we could have very easily predicted. Then we go on and call this the hidden pandemic that, of course, wasn't hidden for any of us. We always knew that it was there. But, the point is we really have to look at it in context. So for me personally, when you ask which men and where and how, my interest, I think it's everyone and everywhere, but that's not an answer, and my interest really in recent years has been to work with younger men. And I think there's really a lot of potential there. I mean, we see so much resistance with men in positions of power and leadership and decision-making, certainly in the political space. I mean, obviously, we're still fighting those guys. And, how well are we doing there? It's really hard to tell. Look at the religious leaders who, by and large, are men and issuing edicts here and there about women's bodies and women's lives and women's choices. How well are we doing on that front with that kind of pushback? Difficult. Not to say that I'm losing hope in us old people, but I really see that the next generation has a lot more potential. They are engaging, they are active, they are activists in a way that is, for me, organic. I look at the Arab region, for instance, and what I see is young people. And first of all, the population of the region is predominantly very young. We've got a large population of youth, and they are active and they are out on the streets and they're engaged in these non-formal ways, covering the intersection of all of these issues of social justice. And I see that as a really encouraging thing, that everybody takes on these issues and occupies public space in order to have their needs met. Is it working? Well, it's getting attention. So these are the people that need to be supported, and particularly these young men. I see a lot of work being done with conversations on intersectionality. And I think that is great, as long as we do not lose the focus on women and girls that have been historically marginalized and now, seem to be somewhat sidelined in the conversation. But, these young men are not asking for help per se, but I think receptive and open to conversations about how to just be better humans, as we're all trying to be. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done still. But I look at things like bystander intervention and all of that kind of stuff that I think is so important, and those conversations that we need to have. And with this younger generation of men, what I'm seeing also is that they're not as interested in taking center stage as, let me generalize and forgive me, the first generation of kind of men engaged activists felt like they were hijacking the agenda in a lot of ways, in terms of the conversation, in terms of mansplaining gender, in terms of the allocation of resources, in terms of the whataboutery that we would get, what about this and what about what? Well, this is now a different generation that have grown up with this conversation. And so this is an opportunity, I think, to really dismantle the patriarchal structures that are causing the backlash in the first place. So how do we have this conversation and build feminist principles that are integral into the way these young men think and how they operate and how they view the world and how they exist in private space, at home, in public space, in the workplace, in schools, and in political houses, everywhere. I think there's evidence there that also is going to make a difference. And that's really what I'd love to see. At the same time, I keep saying, as I speak to younger and younger audiences, which I think is really exciting for me, not that us old people aren't great. Again, we've been doing this work for decades, but, I want the younger generation to finish what they haven't been able to finish. When I speak to young people, they're really interested in being a better ally, and I think that we can show them how that's done in what we have learned in our experience, and they can probably show us a lot as well in terms of the way that they're doing the work, because they don't seem to hijack each other's agendas. They really they marry them in a way that is much more organic, hopefully looking at what is going to build a better future for all of us. So that's a little bit of a hopeful message in that sense. But at the same time, does that mean we take the pressure off of the leaders and decision makers and the resource allocators and the religious leaders and all of those institutions that have historically suffocated us? And I say us globally, all of us, not just women and girls, but really everyone. I don't think they've ever approached things from a human rights perspective and a real kind of integrated agenda that's going to build a better world for everyone. So we still have a lot of work to do, but I'll leave it there because I'm sure you have more questions.
Thank you so much, Lina, for this important a couple of really important reminders. I think one of them is to look at context. There's no one size fits all. Looking at the younger generation being hopeful, and including a younger generation within Men Engage, or a different perspective that is, I think, more accountable to women and girls and to those who are at the margins of the margins, and working feminist informed. And that's, I think, a key takeaway for our work as Men Engage Alliance going forward. And to dismantle patriarchal structures. So look at that as our overall objective. I'm sorry, I hope you're not hearing the background noise too much. My neighbor has decided to do their gardening right at this very moment. I hope it's not too disturbing. I'll mute myself as soon as possible. There are many questions we would like to ask you, but maybe just to pick up on one thing, Lina, that you already made reference to, and I know this is very relevant for the work Bafana is doing as well, asking you a little bit, when we talk about engagement with structures and systems, the role of faith-based actors. So there's in the history and predominance of faith-based actors in the backlash. How can we engage with them or address faith-based communities in countering backlash? Should we engage, and if so, how? And maybe just kind of going back to you, Lina, and then back to Bafana, and then I think, looking at the time, we'll round off our conversation and we'll ask Jurka, Artie, and Neil in for the next round.
Thanks, Joni. You know what? I want to just build on one thing you said that's completely irrelevant, so forgive me. But, in the way that we're working now, you heard you apologizing for the neighbors. I think this is fantastic, because what we've got now is a chance to interact with each other in a way that is much more honest and much more raw. And, you're all in my living room right now, in my kitchen, we're in your house, your neighbors. And that, I think, is important in the way that we cultivate the conversations that we have, and what this creates for us is, first of all, by default, I mean, none of us really wanted it this way, but it's a more inclusive space. It's more engaging. It is more family friendly. There's so many benefits to the way that we're working now, and it helps us cross a lot of barriers. I'm looking for the COVID silver lining. We're crossing a lot of barriers that we otherwise wouldn't have been able to cross. It would have continued, when you think about it, to have these types of conversations only with the small audience that is kind of implicated in it already. Look at us gender people that talk to only gender people. So the way that we do business now means that other people can tune in and pay attention and learn something. And it's an opportunity, first of all, to have these conversations in a way that I think is, like I said, honest, because we're stripped of this professional facade. None of us have taken off pajamas for the last 1 year. I think that's perfectly fine. Dogs and noise and babies and all kinds of things are integrated, and that for us is our real life. And so what we're seeing is that the facade has been lifted in so many ways, and the conversations that we're able to have cross a lot of those barriers, personally, professionally, and also in terms of the sector. So, to bring me in a roundabout way to religious leaders, the idea is that we can reach people in a different way. I think it's critical to work with religious leaders because, as a secular person, this sounds comical to say, but there are so many people who really want to anchor their activism in a religious context, and they will not go forward unless they understand it in that way. And is it compatible? Can it be? Yes, in every religious tradition, I am sure it can be. It just takes a lot of work. But at the same time, religious leaders who globally across all the traditions are predominantly men, have they been allies? Have they been helpful in terms of women's rights and lives and bodies and space and integrity and autonomy? I have a heart. It's a very difficult thing. Are we becoming more secular kind of globally? I think we are. This is not research, on which I am particularly up to speed. But what I do know is that that religion can evolve. These are conversations that need to be ongoing. There are some ideas that we've all had, whether religious or not, that are fundamentally outdated, and we just need to upgrade our systems. So that's a tough fight, and it's a long one. And I wish I was a better person to answer it, but it needs to be. It's a conversation that has to be had. Absolutely.
Thank you, Lina. Would love to hear from you as well, Bafana.
Well, Lina, you are the right person to ask to answer this question, and I think you are raising very interesting ideas. I just want to say, Yoni, religion or religious groupings are not homogeneous. You have conservative elements within religion, but you also have progressive elements. And in my space, we always contend that religion is a site of struggle. I think the mistake we make is not to engage that space and therefore let them be. And unfortunately, they then often tend to do things that regurgitate negative norms and reinforce patriarchy and all of that. And for me, religion shouldn't be treated as a sacred space in that sense of the word. Religion should be challenged. And I'm talking as somebody who's within the religious circles. We need to raise these difficult questions within the religious space. We need to challenge even the reading of the texts. I find, as a Christian myself, that there are many statements that are made so loosely and ideologically to justify what is unjustifiable. But when you get closer to the text and read the context, the historical analysis critically, there are lots of liberatory narratives. Yes, there are problematic narratives within the texts, but there are also very interesting liberatory narratives. Speaking about the South African experience, we were oppressed by a system that was embedded in religion, and on the other hand, the liberation movement was drawing from religion to challenge oppression. And we have lots of women who are doing exciting work within the religious circles, writing, challenging patriarchy, challenging narrow readings of texts. So all I'm saying, Yoni, is that we need to engage. We need to treat religion critically, so that we do not simply allow religion to have an easy ride, that because an imam or a pastor or a theologian has said this, therefore this is the gospel truth. Nothing can be further from the truth. Every gospel truth must be engaged. It must be looked at very closely. It must be scrutinized. Does it really represent what or who God is and how people understand God as a God of justice, as a God of liberation, as a God who empowers, as a God who, at least in the biblical sense, is presented as somebody who created everyone in God's image, which means you cannot discriminate against somebody because all of us have an element of godliness in us. And so we need to push back, with the religious circles and problematize this notion of wanting to simply give us the notion of religion as a patriarchal institution. Challenge that. It cannot be. And there's a lot of pushback. And I can share a lot of experiences on the work we do in Africa with religious leaders. We now have many religious leaders that are champions for gender transformation, who are talking against FGM, who are talking about child marriages, who are challenging a lot of these things that for many years they've taken for granted as the gospel truth. And therefore, because they've been exposed and challenged to really become allies, on this important struggle, we have been able to shift a lot of them who are now champions and speak, progressively on these issues, including challenging their own positions, which should not be taken for granted. Leadership should not be just about men. Leadership should be about people that are part of an institution. And therefore, everybody should have an equal opportunity. And that, for me, is a way of pushing back and not simply allowing these men to simply have their way because they are enjoying the privileges of unearned privileges.
Thank you so much, Lina and Bafana. I think you both mentioned in different ways that religion and faith-based experiences is one of the facts of life for many, many people, very important, and also one of the institutions. And as we are seeking to transform the current status quo and transform the current patriarchal institutions, working with faith-based actors is going to be one of the things that we will have to keep on doing, and also looking at the opportunities there. Bafana, as you were saying, not to homogenize, but to really look at the diversity and those who are progressive within the faith-based groups as well, to work together strategically. So thank you for those insights. With that, I would like to pass it on to Jirka for the next conversation. And Lina and Bafana will invite you back in a little while again. Thank you.
So thank you, Yoni and Lina and Bafana. Those are fascinating set of reflections. It made me think back to the first session with the conversation between Sonia Correa and Denise Candioti. I was thinking, yes, echoing Bafana, we can engage with religious leaders and thought leaders in terms of conscience and humanity and understanding in a democratic way, but we could also ask, when is religion about power as opposed to liberation? And that's relates to some things Denise Candioti was talking about in terms of religion coming into politics and politics becoming more enmeshed in religion in recent years. When we opened this session, we talked about, and this series, we talked about Beijing 95, the platform of action as the goal, the point in time we compared to, but we could also think back 110 years ago was the first International Women's Day. 100 years ago, women started to get the right to vote in different countries. 50 years ago, we had women in development developing as a concept, and the first international conference on women in Mexico City. So along the way, we have had a lot of progress, but we've been here before. But in a large sense, I guess, in a big sense for me, the 20th century was very much the secular century. And a big difference from in the 21st century has been the return of religion into politics, which perhaps relates to the next discussion in terms of we're dealing with policy spaces of government, we're dealing with corporate sectors, we're dealing with civil society, and this is the spaces within which we have to operate. So let me, without further ado, after that preamble, turn to Artie and ask each to reflect for about 3-5 minutes on what are some of the developments unfolding in the context of your work on civic space and gender rights, and perhaps related to that, what kind of strategies have been used or are you planning to use to address those dynamics? Or you can make of it as you please, but it'd be great to hear from you about this, navigating this gendered politics for 3 to 5 minutes. Is that okay?
Yep, perfect. Thank you so much, Joko. And I think your introduction is a nice segue into what I'll be talking about. I think that in terms of civic space, we're definitely, as we've spoken about, seeing a backlash in gender rights. And just to contextualize some of what the work and monitoring we're doing, we're seeing that there have been examples of LGBTI rights being targeted through regressive legislative amendments. And, you talk about the role of religion and politics. We've seen that coming into the mix a lot in Europe and Central Asia, where LGBTI persons have been labeled as an ideology against, these family values that politicians are claiming that they're protecting. So that definitely plays a role. We've seen the persecution of LGBTI activists. We're also seeing that women journalists in the space of the media sphere are often facing violent harassment and intimidation, both online and offline. And often that harassment is very gendered in nature, targeting, these women journalists, not for the work that they do, but specifically because they are women. And we're also seeing that women human rights defenders have remained a target in many of the countries that we are monitoring. And speaking specifically about women human rights defenders, I'd like to share the work that Civicus has done in tackling the backlash against gender rights in Poland specifically. And I think Poland is a good example, again, of how, religion and politics, and together with far-right leaders, are being used to clamp down on the rights of women in the country. So just to give you some context, civic space in Poland has been on decline for a number of years. But in October 2020, last year, the Constitutional Tribunal ruled that to impose a near total abortion ban in Poland, and thus leaving women severely restricted in terms of sexual and reproductive rights. As a result, mass protests erupted in the country, and as our work as Civicus focusing on civic space, we sought to, monitor the developments on the ground of what has been happening with women rights activists in terms of restrictions they were facing. And together, our organization then joined forces with other organizations who have very different mandates from ours. And this is one of the strategies that we used in terms of doing this type of advocacy on sexual and reproductive health rights, but at the same time, focusing on civic space. And our main aim was to coordinate advocacy at the EU level as well as on the international level. And just to give you a sense, I think, and we talked about, intersectional alliance building, the diversity of the group that we were working with had people who focused on reproductive rights, on human rights.
I think we have lost you, Artie. Your connection froze then. Okay, so we were beginning to hear about the alliances being created by Civicus with other groups. And it does look like Artie's connection is frozen for now. So sadly, we heard about 3 minutes, but perhaps we should now then turn to Neil to let me just quickly, unless we have Artie coming back straight away. Okay, Neil. So let's turn to you and ask you to reflect for 3 or 5 minutes about your work with European Parliamentary Forum on how should we respond to this confluence of diverse backlash power brokers in opportunistic alliances. Last in session 2, you were describing how religious movements, for example, may ally with political interests and right-wing parties and so on. Would you like to reflect on that for us? 3-5 minutes?
Yes, thanks, Jörg. In order to better understand how we should respond to well, what's been described as a confluence of diverse power brokers and opportunistic alliances organizing this backlash, I think, first of all, we need to be grounded in a solid understanding of what situation we're facing, and also, first, what situation we're facing, and then from that, to try to place ourselves in the position of those whom we consider our adversaries. So first, in terms of the situation that we're in now, I would like to suggest that we have entered a new historical phase, which is different from the one we have known from basically 1989 with the fall of the Soviet system up until maybe 10 years ago. And that period was characterized by several factors which facilitated our work as progressives. So that there was a predominance of Western influence, and with Western influence came human rights, came democracy, liberal democracy, and also regulated market economies. And that now has disappeared for the past 10 years or so. And instead, we're entering a new phase with a different type of ideas which are in a competitive space for hegemony. And now, if we understand this, then we need to place ourselves in the position of those who are our adversaries, and then consider what are their motives. And one of the first realizations that happens when you do that is the realization that, in fact, we're not confronted with a backlash. Backlash is an incomplete notion. And it's important to realize this. I mean, really, we're confronted with an overlapping set of different political and various other agendas. And the idea of looking at this from a backlash perspective has certain challenges. So that, for example, it isolates those of us working on gender and sexuality from the rest of society, so that we only see what's happening to us, not what's happening everywhere else. By doing this, also, it prevents progressive actors from building solidarities and alliances with other sectors and very far removed sectors from us normally. I'm not talking just about, the SRHR should work with the LGBT, with the women and the progressive religious. We need to look for much broader sectors. And then also, by taking a look at backlash, what happens then is that we're focusing mainly on what is being destroyed, not on the alternative reality that is being created. Because with every act of destruction, there is also an act of creation hidden behind that. And just as one example, right now in Europe, there's a wide-scale contestation against the Istanbul Convention on Gender-Based Violence. So we see this as a backlash against laws on violence against women. But there's in the wings, there's an alternative document called a Charter for Family Rights. And once they kill the Istanbul Convention, the idea is to bring forward this Charter for Family Rights, which would penalize abortion and also put LGBT people back into the closet. So already we can see that there's a destructive agenda and a creative agenda. And by understanding this, we can start seeing with whom it is that we should form alliances, and we can see that there's different overlapping projects. And now it corresponds a little bit to what you were saying in your introduction, Jörg, but it looks like there's basically 3 families of projects that we need to deal with. One family of projects, which is, I think, the one that we're most familiar with, is a theocratic project, or a series of theocratic projects. And this is when a certain number of religious elites have aspirations to reconquer their dominance in the political space, which they had occupied up until maybe 3 generations ago. So it is really, I mean, it really is that recent in many countries, and it's even more recent in some other parts of the world. So there's one part of this theocratic project that we need to realize is that even though it espouses the official doctrine of the religion, it is very far removed from the daily practice of those who say that they are adherents to the religion. So that, just as an example, there's a Catholic doctrine on abortion and contraception. Even the majority of people who describe themselves as Catholic may not follow that social teaching on contraception and abortion. A separate family of projects, in which is one where I think a lot of the progressives, especially working in gender, sexual reproductive health and rights, are blind to, is that of a hyper-capitalistic economic project. So that you see a lot of the same actors on the opposition side, on the anti-gender side, who have very sophisticated thinking on liberalization of market economies, etc., which goes way beyond the capitalism, which was a market-regulated capitalism that we knew from the 1980s and 90s. So I think already that's something that we need to take a look at. It's a type of capitalism which I think our Latin American friends, they were familiar with from the 1970s and 80s, and now it is making a comeback after having been discredited 20 years ago. And then finally, there's a whole family of projects which are that of an illiberal political project. And so that we see these actors also by putting forward different components of the Theocratic Project, the hyper-capitalistic project, also being able to erode at the very foundations of liberal democracy. And so that what this means is that right now we're in a phase where, whereas for the past 20 years, we could simply go in and say, well, we need to promote human rights. This is, we need to enhance democracy. And that was a solid enough argument in and of itself. Now we find ourselves, and I think especially for people of that generation like you and I, Jurker, where we could go in there and that was the argument made. Now we cannot make that argument and make progress. We need to realize that that time is gone. And also, so it's with this understanding that we can also start to build broader alliances. And by broader alliances, I've been thinking really with groups which are not just working on pro-democracy, but also those working on electoral watchdog initiatives, those working on transparency, anti-corruption. Just as an example, there was one of the main anti-gender actors in Europe. I had been following him for many years. I knew he had bankrolled many different anti-gender initiatives completely separately. Another group working on corruption and especially those dark money laundromats coming from Russia, they had been monitoring him, and they found that he had been getting money from that dark money from Russia and its places like this in order to undermine political reports in an institution of the Council of Europe, and then with the money he was getting from Russia, bankrolling anti-gender activities. So there were 3 different components there, all following the same individual, but we hadn't been connected with each other, and we couldn't put the pieces of the puzzle together. So I think we need to have those types of much broader alliances put in place in order to really mount a resistance or a firewall against this movement. And again, backlash is part of it, but there's a much wider systemic shift taking place, which I think we need to be mindful of, and is going to be part of the type of work that we do for the foreseeable future. So I think that's enough of a provocation for now.
Thank you so much. It certainly echoes a lot of what we have discussed and puts things into perspective a little bit in terms of the broader sweep of history and where we are today that is different from in the 90s or the turn of the century, millennium. Now, I'm not sure whether Artie is back.
I am back, yes.
Okay, you're back. Great. So you were actually cut off after about 3 minutes. And so did you want to finish what you had started discussing? I don't know if you remember exactly where you were cut off, but
yeah, I was wondering why everything went quiet. So I have a power cut, unfortunately. But maybe just to pick up on what Neil was saying, I think, which spoke to what I was getting to, is that what Neil was saying is that, we have to go beyond the organizations and the groups that we work in terms of women's rights and sexual reproductive health rights, so that, if organizations are not talking to each other, sometimes things can be missed. So with the example of Poland that I was using, is we're a very large group of organizations, very diverse, which Neil is also part of. As Civicus, we work specifically on civic space issues, but in the case of Poland, it was these intersecting issues of women's rights, LGBTI rights in the context of civic space, in the context of the protests that were taking place, that got us involved in the work that they were doing. And I think the diversity of the organizations, and we talk about, intersectional alliance building, where the bigger issue at the European level for us in terms of advocating when it comes to Poland and Hungary, for example, is under obviously looking at the rule of law issues, which the European Union has obviously got its radar on. But the underlying issues of women's rights and LGBTI rights, we somehow had to collate that and put that forward as well under this broad banner. And I think that we wouldn't have been able to do so if, an organization only focusing on one aspect of the rule of law, or an organization only focusing on women's rights or gender rights, was working separately. So my strategy and my takeaway from doing the advocacy that we've done in Poland is not working in silos. This collective movement building as civil society organizations can be an incredible strength. And at the same time, I think the other strength that we've had in working in Poland is working on the ground with women's rights activists, and their voices and their needs informing our approach in terms of how we kind of engage at an international and European level. I think that's what I left out, and hopefully that is a strategy that we can discuss, and Neil can also feel free to add as well reflections from his side.
That's great, Artie. So, Neil, you might want to ask Artie some questions. I mean, a common, building on what you just said, Artie, I'm thinking there is a natural kind of question around these broader alliances that you're both talking about needing to build, how those are framed, and the question around how does issues in politics of gender identity inflect or affect those choices and dynamics, and are those issues unifying or dividing stakeholders? There's anti-racist movements, decolonization. There is struggles for, well, the 1%, and I guess anti-corruption groups and so on might want to look at. But so the way that you framed it, Neil, I think were slightly different. They were more on the kind of paying attention to the crimes or the issues. So if election monitoring is to deal with authoritarian democratization, and anti-corruption groups would be to deal with corporate capture and takeover. So how do you two see the logic of this, and to what extent gender identity issues, men, women, LGBTQI, and so on, gets in the way or facilitates those alliances? Perhaps, Artie, do you want to continue on that point, and then we pass that back to Neil?
I definitely think that at times, like you said, some organizations would say they don't have a mandate or they can't work on this issue. It's definitely balancing these competing interests. But if we look at long-term strategies on how we carry out this work, I think everything is interconnected and interrelated. So the more we look at things happening and unfolding in gender rights, right? You can't look at it without looking at the political context, without the religious, the religious context. So I think it's incredibly important, but Neil could probably speak at the EU level when he engages in terms of how your messaging is framed around that, right? So this is a rule of law issue, but it is also impacted on X, Y, and Z, particularly women's rights, LGBTI rights, right? But how do you almost phrase that in a way that is, I don't know, appealing or palatable to policymakers and politicians who would probably prioritize a rule of law issue versus, abortion rights, for example. I don't know if it's an answer, but that's what my thinking is around that.
Good reflections. And within that, how does men and masculinities come into it? That becomes invisibilized perhaps in the process, and could counterproductively feed into this kind of male ressentiment and sort of. Over to you, Neil. What's your thought about this? How we handle gender identity issues in these alliances, and thinking through that. You're on mute at the moment. Just to.
All right. Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah. So thank you. In terms of these alliances, I think there's different ways of looking at them. First, at a very practical level, between the different civil society groups, there I think we need to see that it's a number of different organizations and groups and individuals who they don't realize that they have a lot in common. So that if you take a look at Poland, since Artie very elegantly described it, there's so many wrong things happening in that same country all together at the same time. It's women's rights, it's LGBT, it's the rule of law, it's democracy, it's the independence of the judiciary, it's all of these things. And not all of the different civil society actors, as expert as they may be, will even have the skill set to understand what the others are talking about. Okay. So already, so that has to be overcome, and they may not realize that that in fact it's the same rot affecting Poland. It's just a different perspective that you have in terms of how you analyze it. Separately, at a very strategic level, we need to think, this is what's happening in Poland as an example. Okay, what are the legal bases that we can use which will have the most impact? So that, for example, we may have a lot of support for critiquing Poland on its abortion situation and its near abortion ban. Legally speaking, there's very little that we can do about that. There's more we can do on LGBT rights, and there's potentially much more we can do on the rule of law. But what happens on the rule of law is much more politically costly for those who have to decide on that. So there's a whole range of different strategic discussions that have to be, or different strategic decisions that have to be negotiated by civil society, and then different levels of the political decision-making structure, so that on the one hand, we have a lot of support from at a legislative level in some legislatures in the European Parliament. But we don't have enough support in the executives from governments who really do need to make these decisions. And equally, we're missing any awareness at the national level in the legislatures in most countries. So therefore, we don't have enough political pressure at national level in capitals to put on the executive to then make decisions at EU level. So it's something that needs to be done at several levels, both at civil society and at political level. I think I've only answered part of that, part of your question.
Great. Okay. Thanks. Artie, did you want to come back on that at all with any further reflection?
Not really much to add, but just to say that I think, something that I think going forward that we should really think about constructively is, how we can collectively and intersectionally work together, rather than, as Neil said, one group has an expertise on this and the world is interconnected, right? So the more we connect and the more we have these discussions, I think the more fruitful it will be, I guess.
Okay, so in the interest of time, Yoni, as my co-chair, how do you suggest shall we open up for the plenary, or shall we continue this conversation a bit longer?
No, I think it would be great to bring 4 speakers together. So we invite Bafana and Lina back in as well. And
Yeah.
I've been having a look at the chat box to see if there's any questions that have come in. We don't have questions as such. So Jurka, I think we can have a look at our own question book and see what we want to put forward. We do have a couple of reflections, so I just want to share those so that we really invite the audience in as good as or the participants in as good as possible. We have Camille Cummings, who is from Trinidad and Tobago. She shared a couple of reflections, one of them being, I think her experience of when you focus on men and men's issues, there you also receive backlash from women and women who are feminists. I can personally say I would not frame that as backlash. I would frame that as part of, I think, a healthy and very needed discussion on whether the work with men and boys really contributes to women's rights and feminist progress. So I would invite to reflect on that and not perceive any questions around men's involvement as backlash as such. That's my personal reflection, and I think reflects how Men Engage would look at that as well. But she also shared what is wrong with women having multiple relationships. So that was in response to polygamy only being permitted for men, and why has it always been such an issue for women to have such choices. And we had Makbul Ahmed. I'm sorry I did not have time to look back where they are from, but shared some reflections around the COVID-19 pandemic and how it's really directed kind of all of the efforts that have been going on in the last few years, in the last few years, in the 1.5 years by now. But it's really important that authorities support financially those who are most in need and most vulnerable. Yes, and thanks to honorable speakers for all of what you've shared. And then we have a response from Fiston Lukeba from Ramrek in Rwanda, our co-organizers in the symposium. And he shared some reflections in French, which I loosely translated to English. And his suggestion is in relation to the different strategies that we can adopt to fight against the hostile reactions. It would be good to create a movement of young people from the different religions who can have exchange activities on the framework and reflection about different hostile reactions that should be avoided. These young people may be students and who can then influence those around them and so on. And Bafana reflected on that is a great suggestion. So with that, Jurka, I think you can go forward and asking a question to our speakers, but also continue to invite, I continue to invite people who are listening in to share your questions with the speakers in the chat box.
Yeah, thank you. So this is obviously a very wide-ranging discussion. So we're touching on a lot of issues, moving from the big politics of epoch-changing shifts in power between corporate interests and religious interests and authoritarian political interests and so on one hand, and sort of what we do as civil society organizations working in communities and with researchers and so on a much more, close to home level, perhaps. Interesting suggestions coming up in terms of, there's a couple of reflections I had on the back of what Artie and Neil was discussing there around how we create these broader alliances. One thing that struck was I think it was suggested that show communities or members in these movements what they actually have in common, perhaps beyond our gender identities. So the issue of, do men have a stake in feminist or gender equality? By looking at masculinities as being harmful to men, there are ways of showing that we can actually a different future is better for all of us. There's also the idea of exposing the kind of divisive lies by the leaders, certain leaders, about the actual interests of their constituents. So this issue about certain, for example, conservative religious leaders maybe being quite far from the daily lives of their faith communities and what they actually experience. Sorry, I should stop rabbiting on about that, but rather ask the question as in terms of the Men Engage Alliance. This is the closing session at the Men Engage Alliance's symposium, Ubuntu Symposium, for this series on patriarchal backlash. So really an obvious question that we should pose is how can the Men Engage Alliance act in solidarity with other gender justice activists and leaders who are under attack? And how should the Alliance support and strengthen efforts by feminist allies against backlash? Building, I guess, on former discussions to some extent. It'd be nice to hear from Lina, Neil, and Artie, and then perhaps, and then definitely Bafana as well, but from you outside of the Alliance directly first, what do you think that a network or a formation like the Men Engage Alliance ought to be doing about this? Anybody happy to go first? Neil, you've got your microphone unmuted. Are you okay to reflect on that for a start?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Maybe just some initial thoughts, and I think it will be very obvious to everyone on this on this webinar, but it may be worthwhile reiterating, and that's really emphasizing and communicating more broadly that on the one hand, patriarchy is harmful to men as well. Patriarchy is a system that slots all people, including men, into predetermined roles, and that's not good for many men as well. So it is a pro-man agenda to be trying to undo patriarchal systems in themselves. It's not just to benefit women. As men, we benefit from undermining patriarchy as well. Separately, feminism is not just about women either. It's not just a pro-women's agenda. Feminism also benefits men. And I think that needs to be articulated as well. So I think everyone on this call will recognize this, but I think maybe going back to the basics about how we communicate about certain things is useful. Separately, about religion, I think there may be also doing a bit of homework into remembering the history of religion and how religious hierarchies specifically have dealt with issues related not just to human rights, but to broader questions of equality and inequalities. I mean, it was up until fairly recently that the Catholic Church formally supported the authoritarian regimes of Latin America and the Iberian Peninsula. It was not just tacit, it was a formal engagement in them. And then also, if we take a look at the recent history of religious movements, and here I'm thinking specifically the Catholic Church, there may be progressive movements there, but the trend line of where the Catholic hierarchy has been going has been to follow the more conservative movements. And I think that's something we need to keep in mind also as we think about if and how do we engage with the religious movements. The hierarchy is following its own strategic path, and it may not be one that is conducive to what we want to achieve. So I think doing our own homework in that respect would also be useful.
Thank you, Neil. Those are great reflections. And it reminded me that we did call this series Countering Patriarchal Backlash. The strand I lead in our Countering Backlash program is called the Patriarchy Strand, and it comes from a history of trying to politicize work on masculinity, or politicizing work on masculinities. So focusing on patriarchy as being bad for all of us, feminism as being good for all of us, and keeping an eye on hierarchy and power were the three takeaways I got from that. Lina, Artie, Lina, you're happy? You want to go next?
I'm happy.
Yeah, go.
Absolutely.
Thanks.
Okay, so what can the Alliance do? I think this is really interesting. Yeah, there are lots of good arguments, right? And I'm grateful for the evidence. And yes, feminism and equality benefit men, absolutely a strong argument. Yes, the mother-sister argument is not one of my favorites, but yes, a lot of people can connect with that. But what is the compelling argument for me is that this is the right thing to do. It does not have to be because it benefits you directly. It does not have to be because there is a woman related to you that you can connect with and suddenly you develop this instant empathy. It is because it is the right thing to do. And I think that kind of social awareness and consciousness is something that we are still, as humans, I say, cultivating with some difficulty. So, what can the Alliance do? Listen to women and really let them lead, right? Learn from what is going on and take some cues in terms of where there is value in intervening, because there is strength in allyship. We are stronger together. It is also about creating space. It is about, as we say, passing the mic. There is obviously a historic disadvantage. And we keep saying, women's voices or whatever. Women have voices. They don't have microphones. So pass the mic. I was very moved by something that a young man told me in Afghanistan. I worked in Afghanistan from 2002 until 2006. So this quote has stuck with me now for a long time. And I asked him, what do you think of all this work on women and empowerment and liberation and whatever? It was very much a part of that agenda. Now we're seeing that conversation resurface, having gone nowhere, clearly, for Afghan women. And he said to me, the world thought they could bring freedom to Afghan women, but freedom is only won from the inside. And I think the argument there, it's so nuanced and so beautiful. It still gives me chills to say it. And the idea is that people on the inside who are directly implicated know best what they want, where they want to go, and how to get there. So it is incumbent upon all of us, as me, I was very kind of humbled by that. I'm not Afghan. So I said, okay, it's time for me to shut up and listen and hear from Afghan women what they want and how I can help them provide the tools and resources to do that. And it's the same kind of thing, we're talking about the religious argument. And I said, oh, I'm not the best person to talk about it. And I love what Bafana said, but the idea that, because I'm not a religious person, I'm not going to come up with the best arguments for how to counter that kind of backlash or that kind of resistance. So what I want to see, and same for this, is the people from the inside who are already fighting that fight, take it forward. And those of us who are on the outside, whatever outside might mean, providing the tools, the resources, the support, the amplification of the cause in whatever way they want to be able to make it bigger, better, and get the change done faster. So that's what I would say about all of that. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent. So, Artie, can we hear, have you got thoughts on this?
Yes, sorry, I'm just putting my video off because of my internet connection. I think following on what Lina and Neil said, this work of gender equality is everyone's work, right? And I think in terms of going back to alliance building, I think not just focusing on, civil society organizations that deal only in gender rights or LGBTI rights, but working with organizations that deal with broader issues and showing them as well that, there is work to be done on their side as well. Because I think this idea that, gender work is only delegated to specific organizations or specific movements is problematic if we're thinking of things holistically and collaboratively. So I think in terms of alliance building, I think working with civil society organizations that may not be considered, mainstream in gender or in gender equality, but at the same time ensuring that there's movement building happening across CSO so that we can work collectively rather than in silos.
Excellent. Very good. So those are some of our recommendations to the Men Engaged Alliance. So Bafana, as both a member and a co-chair of the Alliance, perhaps you want to reflect on that or give us some of your own ideas for it, or both?
I can only underscore what colleagues have said because I think they've made very important points. I agree with all the points that Neil raised. I think they are spot on. And I agree with Lina. I agree with your challenge, Lina. This is very important that in allyship we need, and we are cognizant of this as Men Engage, to what extent do we ensure that in this allyship we pass the mic? It's not that women can't speak. Women do speak and do want to speak. Often women are not listened to. Often women are not given spaces by the structural system that would prefer to listen to a man than listen to a woman. And so the point we are pushing back on for us as Men Engage is very important. I should say that we deliberately appointed a woman CEO, for instance, at Men Engage, not because we wanted to do a PR exercise, but because we felt it's important, because we need to have leadership that really drives this movement in the directions that we want to get to. We have representation of women in our board, and we always ensure that we create that allyship at all levels of our engagement as Men Engage. Some people ask, the contradiction. We are Men Engage, but you have women. For us, it's not an issue. Men Engage is a strategy of achieving the bigger goal of transformation. And so it's not a contradiction to have women leading in a Men Engage platform. For us, it's really, it makes perfect sense. And we need, and I agree with Artie, we need to continue to build these alliances so that this movement is strong. I want to just cite Hijacking, because of some of the work we are doing in our region in Africa, for instance, and the resistance and part of the backlash, and I agree with, I think, Charlotte or Marion raised something, Chloe raised the issue of how, the backlash is also in how people strangle organizations by restricting funding, for instance, or denying funding. We have a situation now where some AU elements are intimidating UN agencies not to support the work we are doing because we support sexual diversity programs, because we are very forthright on LGBT rights. And strangely, they are pushing UN agencies who are also getting intimidated on a funding that is provided by the European Union on the Spotlight Initiative, which is intended to enhance programs that end gender-based violence. Now, how do you do programs that are geared towards ending gender-based violence in Africa without attending to violence against LGBT community? You can't do that. But because this work is challenging patriarchy at its core, those who are defending it want to use issues of sovereignty to try and silence these voices and control where resources should be going, control how people should do programming on these issues. And we are pushing back. And we are saying this cannot be accepted. We want to challenge the UN about this. We want to challenge the European Union, because we cannot accept that a few men decide where developmental funding should be going, and they will accept if only it goes against an agenda that suits their intentions, which is to undermine rights of others in their communities. That cannot be accepted. And these are the things that I think we need to ensure that we strengthen our allyship, so that in this movement there's a groundswell of resistance of this kind of behavior. We also do need to challenge religious groupings, by the way. I mean, we've just come out of an era in the US where a madman was supported by religious groups. It was amazing how this man was being prayed for, was being celebrated, in spite of everything that he was doing. Rude comments he was making about women, undermining women's rights, setting up committees that are just by men, and yet they're deciding about sexual reproductive rights of women. And the religious leaders were celebrating this man, And that's the contradiction that I'm saying. Therefore, Lina, we should not allow these men to simply say, no, 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 I can't get involved here. These are religious. We must challenge them. This is not correct. We must call them out. We must push back. Because if we let them off to do these things to their devices, you can imagine the damage that they will do. And the point that Neil says about, us being careful about religion, I accept totally. Religion has always been conflicted. Religion likes to fraternize with power. Religions generally wants to be in the palace. And so unless we pull it out of the palace and remind them that religion is supposed to be with the poor and marginalized and those that are treated unjustly, we will get religion, unfortunately, being at the service of power, of the economic powerhouses who use them to advance their agendas. And so I think through this allyship and movement building, there's a lot that we can do. The challenge we have now with COVID apartheid, for those of us in the South, we're still struggling. The vaccines are coming in drips and drabs, yet we have countries that have amassed so much vaccines that they have doubled the numbers of what they actually require. They are hoarding them. That can't be allowed in a world where we are confronted by a pandemic that's facing us. So these are issues that I always challenge my colleagues that as men engage, we really need to be at the coal face of challenging these issues, because it's not just about how we talk about gender rights. It's also about how systems are being used to enhance these norms that undermine women, that put women down, that destroy women's lives, either using the economy, using policies, using politicians. And it's up to us as civil society to push back and say, it's not okay. Find alliances in people like Neil, who may be politicians or part of engagements in policies. How do we ensure that we, build these alliances with those forces that are there, but are progressive and are wanting to see transformation? And I think it can be done. We just need to be much more vigilant and ensure that we reach out to those that we can hold hands with, and those that are creating problems, we call them out and call them out consistently. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We are nearing the end of this plenary. Yoni, do you want to share the reflections, any reflections from participants?
Yeah, just two reflections there that were shared, and Bafana referenced the first one from Chloe Skinner, who I believe is a colleague, Jurker, in the IDS program that you will be talking a little bit more in the next few minutes. But she says, one reflection I have relates to what Artie and Neil discussed in terms of alliances. It makes me think of the different ways that Backlash operates in terms of siloization and NGOization and funding environments. Many of our partners in the IDS program on the Countering Backlash program noted that these two are means through which backlash operates, dissecting social justice movements and solidarity. Artie and Neil's points on alliance building across diverse movements is a direct form of countering backlash by refusing to be kettled into neat little boxes. Thank you for that, Chloe. And Marion Guibaudo from France shared in French, so this is translated loosely into English. Hello, in the professions that do prevention with young people on the issues of sexism and gender-based violence, there are still many women. On the ground, we also need men who work with their partners. Young people need different role models. A network like Men Engage might have tools in common to motivate men to get involved. On the ground in France, we are short of men. And she also reflected, absolutely, it is important to think about how resources are allocated and with which specifications and under which disciplines. In France, part of the work with men is with a psychological and therefore individual entry, but we need a multidisciplinary entry in order to allow for really interesting reconstruction of, and I think of masculinities there, of gender norms, and I think deconstruction of patriarchy. So with that, I want to pass it back to you, Jurker, and just see how we want to wrap up the conversation for today.
Okay, so thank you all in terms of the plenary discussion. There's some great recommendations, reflections here, from focusing on power and patriarchy to focusing on the right thing to do, social justice for its own sake, and finding the people in the inside who are like-minded. Also, organizations kind of constantly working to broaden our issues to focus on, and as Bafana said as well, in terms of building an allyship, how can we ensure we pass the mic? I would have liked, well, we will pass the mic back to you, Yoni, as the female executive mentioned, leading the alliance. So I can't wrap that up any more justly, but just to move on then to the wrapping up of the session itself. I'll hand over to Yoni to talk about the ways forward for the Men Engage Alliance, first of all. And don't forget, this involves the new strategy where there is an objective to actually focus on countering backlash as part of the strategy. Then I can reflect briefly on next steps in our Countering Backlash program and possibilities for collaboration down the road. Many of the speakers on this series have been linked to our programs in other ways or been advisors to the program, but not all by any stretch of the imaginations. We're continuing to build networks to try to broaden the conversation. But anyway, then we'll thanks and close. So Yoni, over to you.
Well, Jurka, why don't you go ahead and share about the IDS program actually and wrap up, and then I'll do the final wrap up and
makes sense.
Looking forward.
Okay. So that makes sense. So coming to the end of this series, which has been great to do, I'm really glad we pulled it off, particularly in a year of COVID, which comes into the conversations on a regular basis, either as this external inconvenience or as a new reality where backlash is actually being played out. So yeah, our program is, as a result of COVID, actually had faced slowdowns. We had, we were in a startup phase. The weeks after our inception workshop, we were in lockdown through COVID in March last year. And the last year has been, we're learning to work in a very different way. This Symposium series have actually been really helpful in lots of ways to broaden that conversation and carry on having the kinds of conversations we need to have. But in the process, we've also secured a 1-year extension with Swedish SIDA, which is very generous of them, and based on the delays linked to the epidemic. We now finish in September 2025 rather than 24. So we have some more time, which also means that that's more time running alongside the Men Engage Alliance and your strategy, and hopefully along the way finding opportunities to reconnect and take this conversation and our ongoing research projects, finding spaces where we can come back together regularly to reflect and share our lessons and learning, because this is a moving feast. This is not a feast or moving ordeal, I should say, which we're all dealing with. And so part of what I'd like to say, I suppose, as well, is that we want our research to be useful and relevant. So conversations about this kind of conversations, about what recommendations are we looking for in terms of social justice actors, needs to influence not only how we phrase our recommendations, but how we direct our research, what we look for, and what we pay attention to. So I think that's pretty much it. There are possibilities for collaboration. Our doors are open. We are, as I mentioned, running very much in parallel with Men Engage on this. We're both supported by Swedish SIDA, which is a like-minded donor. We're going into a phase of trying to set up alliances or linking with strategic peers for influencing policy as kind of a strand of work outside of but connected to the research. And that obviously then connects with groups like Men Engage Alliance, Kvinna till Kvinna, other groups. Civicus is very interesting, of course, European Forum. We're talking to the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy in Berlin, UNDP's Inclusive Civil Governance Initiative, Regional Inclusive Civil, I forget the name, Regional Inclusive Governance Initiative. Anyway, so that's us, and we're moving forward refreshed and inspired by this series, and look forward to more connecting. So over to you, Yoni.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jurka, for that wrap up. And I really want to thank our speakers for today. Thank you, Lina, Neil, Artie, Bafana. And it's been really great to listen to your reflections and to your recommendations. I think for Men Engage's work, a lot of takeaways there. I'll get back to those in a little bit. But for now, just really wanted to thank you for being here with us, and I think, yeah, strategically advising us and sharing your analysis. And it's been tremendously helpful. And we will also continue using this conversation as well as the other conversations that took place in this series and more broadly in the Men Engage Ubuntu Symposium to inform our further strategizing and learning on how to counter backlash. So it's not only that we had this conversation in this space for 2 hours, but we will continue to revisit this conversation and hopefully also develop some learning materials through your voices to work with the Men Engage Alliance membership to strengthen the work that's being done in countering backlash and more broadly. And with that, I just wanted to share this with you, and Jurka already referenced it, but within the new Men Engage Alliance strategic plan, we have a clear commitment to step it up when it comes to countering backlash. And we have an area of work that is around strengthening programming, really strengthening programming on the ground with the Men Engage membership. One of the key takeaways that we hear from advice from feminist colleagues, advice that we got from the recent evaluation that we undertook is that there's need to further strengthen how the Men Engage Alliance principles are operated on the ground in the programming, in the activities that Men Engage members are conducting. And so one of those is to step it up on countering backlash against feminist progress. And so we have really centered that in our work in the coming years. And so and I think these conversations, that's why I want to highlight it, have really been starting to inform that work going forward. And we want to strengthen our collective actions as Men Engage Alliance through our community of practice approach. So through bringing together experts like yourselves, the Men Engage membership, bringing us strategically together to think, to analyze, and to chart ways forward. So one thing that we're going to be concretely doing is to organize the learning initiative on how to better understand and respond to feminist backlash from a feminist-informed men and masculinities perspective. And I really want to highlight that feminist-informed part as one of the key, intersectional feminist-informed part as one of the key contributions, I think, that we are anchoring through the Men Engage Alliance's work. And I want to echo also what, Lina, you mentioned a couple of times on centering women and girls' voices in that. And I would say if we add like an intersectional feminist perspective to that, that means all women and girls, and also looking at who are at the margins of the margins within and among women and girls, and more broadly. And so also we're advancing here the conversation on racial justice and economic justice, social justice more broadly. So for us, intersectional feminist work on men and masculinities is really important in that. We want to synthesize and share feminist critical analysis of men's rights and anti-feminist movements, and to share those among the Men Engage membership to really inform their work and identify lessons learned. And develop basically a strategy on how to understand and respond to backlash better. One of the questions that we didn't get to ask today, which for me is a really important one going forward, is are we going to be responsive to to anti-feminist men and so-called men's rights groups? Are we going to be responsive and counter their messaging? Or are we not giving them more airtime and space and visibility and basically ignore and chart a positive way forward that really invites men who are on the fence, people from different walks of life, in towards a progressive vision for humanity? And for me, that balance between giving more light to those who are anti, or giving more light and more microphone to those who are progressive and forward-looking, for me, that's a key question that we will have to figure out, and hope to count further on your advice there as well. But in the end, what we want to do is to be more vocal on countering backlash, and in whatever way we will be doing that. So like I said, this series has been really important in that. I also want to just, in reference to my executive director leadership, really recognize that in Men Engage Global Alliance, we have a co-leadership. Lakshman Belbas is co-director together with me. And we model, I think, that kind of diverse leadership, and also trying not to take too much space, but creating spaces where people can come together and where leadership is shared by all, where the microphones are held and we hear everyone, especially those who are most marginalized. So I just wanted to emphasize that. With that, I think we're wrapping up this series, and we'll look forward to everything that is to come, and look forward to following your work as well, of the speakers here, and have that inform our work. And my last task is to share a little bit about the ongoing program going forward the next couple of weeks. Just Jurker, is there anything else that we want to say to wrap up this session in the series before I move into the ongoing program?
No, I just thank everybody deeply. And maybe I forgot to mention, the sessions have been recorded and they are available on YouTube links. I'm still writing up the session. I mean, I've written up the four first sessions in very, very brief caricature with links, but we hope to develop some kind of documentation of this series. We're not quite sure what it would look like yet, but maybe something to keep an eye out for, and that we can get back to you with in terms of sharing.
Perfect, excellent. This will definitely, these are not conversations in isolation. We will keep sharing them and taking learnings from them. You can continue to register on the Men Engage website /Symposium. And this will be wonderful, our closing event on the 22nd of June, where we will really wrap up the symposium in a similar vibrant event as we started in November. And we will also be launching our Ubuntu declaration and call to action on that day, really charting the way forward for the work in the coming years. And with that, I want to say thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you in the next sessions, and wishing everybody a really good day or evening, depending on where you are. And take care, be safe. I hope your family and friends are doing well in these very challenging times under COVID-19. So everybody be safe. Take care.